Amidst the vast and boundless expanses of the largest landmass on Earth, a realm that never sleeps, blanketed in bitter ice and snow for months on end, a single question once echoed through human history. Where did the greatest and most resilient nation on Earth originate? The striking truth is that the history of the power we call Russia today did not begin within the opulent palaces of Moscow or the majestic capital of St. Petersburg. Instead, it emerged from deep, freezing forests, treacherous marshlands, and the great waterways of Eastern Europe, where ancient Slavic tribes once lived fragmented and devoid of order. By the 9th century, these lands were a battleground of conflict. The Eastern Slavs were locked in endless internecine warfare. Though blessed with rich forests and bountiful rivers, they lacked a leader strong enough to impose law and order. According to ancient chronicles, in the year 862, Slavic tribal leaders sent a message to the northern warriors known as the Varangians, the Vikings of Scandinavia, with a brief statement that changed history forever. Our land is vast and abundant, but there is no order within it. Come, rule and be our sovereign lords.
Responding to that call was the legendary Viking chief Rurik, bringing both the art of warfare and a system of governance to organize the land. Rurik established the Rurik dynasty, naming this new people and realm Rus, the root word from which Russia was born.
Following the era of Rurik, the center of power shifted south to Kiev, birthing a grand realm known as Kievan Rus. Under Prince Vladimir the Great in 988, the ultimate cultural turning point occurred. Vladimir abandoned the ancient pagan gods and embraced Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire. This decision not only tethered Kievan Rus to medieval European civilization, but forged the Orthodox spirit into the bedrock of Russian identity to this very day.
Kievan Rus reached its absolute golden age as a paramount hub of trade, education, and architecture in Eastern Europe. Yet, this glory was short-lived, as the darkest terror in its history began creeping in from the east. In the 13th century, while the Rus princes were fractured and locked in feuds, the winds of destruction blew the Mongol hordes out of the Asian steppes. Led by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the ruthless Mongol cavalry swept through Kievan Rus like a whirlwind. In 1240, the once glorious city of Kiev fell. Homes were burned to ash, and countless citizens were slaughtered or enslaved. Ancient chronicles record that the land of Rus plunged into pitch darkness, with virtually no city spared from the Mongols' fiery wrath. This era came to be known as the Tartar Yoke, a period lasting over 2 centuries, during which the Rus endured oppressing rule under the Golden Horde. Forced to pay heavy tribute and subjugate themselves before the Khan, starvation, fear, and war wounds were burned into the Russian DNA, instilling a harsh lesson: to be weak is to be destroyed. Yet, within that darkness, a humble town hidden deep in the forest, long overlooked, Moscow, quietly began to grow. The princes of Moscow used clever maneuvers, acting as tax collectors for the Mongols, to win trust and consolidate Rus lands bit by bit. This culminated in the reign of Prince Ivan the Great, Ivan III. In 1480, Ivan took a stand no Rus prince had ever dared. He tore up the Mongol tribute agreement and led the Russian army to confront the horde at the Ugra River. The waning, fractured Mongols dared not cross the river to attack Moscow, ultimately retreating. The Mongol yoke that had crushed the Rus for over 2 centuries was shattered forever. Moscow became the new center of the nation, and Ivan declared himself the unifier of all Russian lands. With the Mongol yoke broken, Moscow stepped into a new era, ready to establish itself as an empire. But peace never lasted long on Russian soil. Ivan the Great's grandson was about to rise to power, a man who would claim the title of Tsar for the first time in history, using absolute power, fear, madness, and the blood of his people to forge a vast realm. A monarch known as Ivan the Terrible. And a bloody new conflict was about to unfold. In the year 1547, a 16-year-old youth, scarred by the abuse of noble boyars during his childhood, was crowned with a title never before used in this land, Tsar, derived from the Roman Caesar. This young man was Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Initially, Ivan reformed the laws and expanded his territory eastward, conquering the Mongol Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. But a devastating blow struck when his beloved wife, Anastasia, died mysteriously. Grief, rage, and the deep-seated paranoia that she had been poisoned by the boyars ignited a flame of madness within the first Tsar. Ivan established history's first Russian secret police force, the Oprichniki, men dressed in black on black horses, bearing the insignia of a dog's head and a broom, signifying their mission to hunt down and sweep away any enemy of the Tsar. Russia plunged into an age of terror. The royal court turned into an execution ground as tens of thousands of nobles and commoners were tortured and slain. Even the major city of Novgorod was burned and its populace massacred simply on suspicion of treason. Ivan's madness reached its tragic peak in 1581 when he engaged in a heated argument with his eldest son and capable heir, Tsarevich Ivan. In a fit of uncontrolled rage, the Tsar struck his son on the head with his iron-pointed staff, fracturing his skull. The prince died in his father's arms. The image of an all-powerful autocrat weeping over his son's lifeless body became a heartbreaking symbol of the age. When Ivan the Terrible died, Russia was left without a strong heir, tumbling into one of its darkest epochs. The period between 1598 and 1613 became known as the Time of Troubles. Order vanished, and devastating droughts and famine forced people to eat tree bark and animal carcasses. External enemies, Poland and Sweden, seized the opportunity. Polish forces captured Moscow and installed a puppet king. The Russian nation hovered on the brink of total destruction and erasure from the map. Yet in its darkest hour, the Russian spirit reawoke. Peasants, nobles, and Orthodox clergy united into a volunteer army led by Dmitry Posharsky and Kuzma Minin, driving the Polish forces out of Moscow in 1612. To end the chaos, a national assembly elected a new king, 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov, crowned in 1613. Thus began the Romanov dynasty, a line that would rule Russia for more than 3 centuries. Nearly a century passed, and Russia remained a backward, landlocked nation, isolated from Western Europe, until the arrival of a titan who altered its fate forever, Tsar Peter I, or Peter the Great. Standing 2 meters tall, physically imposing, and possessing a boundless intellect, Peter did what no Tsar had ever done. He traveled, disguised as a shipwright, to Western Europe to study shipbuilding, military tactics, medicine, and technology. Seeing firsthand how far behind Russia lagged, he returned determined to tear up the nation's old playbook. Peter ordered nobles to shave their traditional beards and wear European attire. He modernized the army, established Russia's first navy, and embarked on the Great Northern War against the maritime superpower Sweden to secure access to the Baltic Sea. In 1703, on the frozen, swampy banks of the Neva River reclaimed from Sweden, Peter conjured a new capital out of nothing, St. Petersburg, known as the Window to Europe. Building it cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of laborers and serfs who perished from disease, cold, and exhaustion,
earning it the name "a city built on bones." Yet the result was one of the most magnificent and influential capitals in Europe. In 1721, Tsar Peter officially renamed the country from the Tsardom of Muscovy to the Russian Empire, proclaiming himself emperor. Russia was no longer a remote woodland state. It had transformed into a major European power that the entire continent had to reckon with. The Russian Empire surged to greatness in the north. But a few decades later, the fiercest test in European history arrived at its doorstep when the conqueror of Europe, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte of France, led a massive army of over 600,000 men toward Moscow. Following the death of Peter the Great, the Russian Empire weathered internal court rivalries. Yet in the second half of the 18th century, the throne of St. Petersburg reached its zenith under a German princess without a drop of Russian blood, Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, whom the world would come to know as Catherine the Great or Catherine II. Through sharp intellect, decisiveness, and a coup that deposed her husband, Catherine seized power and reigned for 34 years. Fully carrying on Peter the Great's vision, she reformed administration, patronized Enlightenment culture, and expanded Russia's borders to their greatest extent yet. Catherine defeated the Ottoman Empire, seized the Crimean Peninsula, secured access to the Black Sea, and partitioned Poland into the empire. Under her rule, Russia became a top-tier European power, leading her to famously declare, "If I could live for 200 years, all of Europe would be brought under the Russian shadow." Yet Russia's power was soon challenged by the greatest crisis since the Mongol invasion. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte gathered the largest military force of the era, the Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong, and crossed the Niemen River into Russia to force Tsar Alexander I into submission. All of Europe assumed that the undefeated general would crush Russia within weeks. Instead, Napoleon encountered a ruthless strategy crafted by the Russian commander-in-chief, Mikhail Kutuzov. Knowing a direct confrontation could mean defeat, Kutuzov ordered Russian forces to retreat deep into the interior, employing a scorched earth policy. They burned their own villages, food supplies, crops, and wells, leaving nothing behind for the French army to consume. Napoleon attempted to force a decisive battle at Borodino, the single bloodiest day of combat in the 19th century, resulting in over 70,000 casualties. Though France gained the field, Napoleon failed to destroy the Russian army. When he entered Moscow in September, he found only a ghost town set ablaze by its own people, turning the ancient capital into an ocean of fire. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin for a letter of surrender from Tsar Alexander I, but it never arrived. With no provisions, no shelter for the impending winter, and no peace offers, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat in October. It was then that Russia's deadliest ally made its appearance: winter. Temperatures plummeted below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Blinding blizzards battered the French troops. Starving soldiers were reduced to eating dead horses and freezing by the roadside in the hundreds of thousands. To make matters worse, Russian Cossack cavalry relentlessly harassed the retreating columns. Of the 600,000 men who invaded, fewer than 50,000 survived the retreat. The invasion of Russia marked the beginning of Napoleon's end. Russian forces pursued the French all the way to Paris, where Tsar Alexander I rode triumphantly through the city as the liberator of Europe. Russia stood as an unchallenged military titan. Yet this splendor masked deep internal fractures. Social inequality was rotting the empire from within. The vast majority of the population remained bound in serfdom, oppressed and impoverished for centuries. Though serfdom was eventually abolished, it came too late. Popular resentment against the ruling class was reaching a boiling point. The fires of revolution were smoldering in the shadows, and the tragic dysfunction of the last Tsar's court, swayed by the influence of a mystic named Rasputin, was about to send the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty plummeting into the abyss. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire resembled a giant standing on feet of clay. Though imposing on the outside, it was decaying within. Class inequality had reached dangerous levels, leaving millions starving while the court lived in extravagant luxury. On January 22, 1905, remembered as Bloody Sunday, hundreds of thousands of unarmed citizens, led by Father Georgy Gapon, marched peacefully to the Winter Palace to present a petition for food and reform to Tsar Nicholas II, whom they called their Little Father. But instead of mercy, they met a hail of bullets and bayonet charges from the Imperial Guard. Thousands were cut down on the snow. The people's devotion to the Tsar died that day, and Nicholas II was branded Nicholas the Bloody. Amidst this crisis of faith, the court fell under the sway of a Siberian mystic, Grigory Rasputin. Claiming miraculous ability to heal the hemophilia of the heir, Tsarevich Alexei, Rasputin gained the absolute trust of Empress Alexandra. He meddled in politics, dismissing and appointing ministers at whim, igniting scandals that alienated the nobility. Though a group of aristocrats brutally assassinated Rasputin in 1916, it was too late to restore faith in the Romanov monarchy. When World War I broke out in 1914, it proved to be the final nail in the empire's coffin. Tsar Nicholas II made the fatal mistake of taking personal command at the front, leaving domestic governance in chaos. The war brought catastrophic defeats, with Russian military casualties exceeding 2 million. Soldiers lacked ammunition and boots, troops mutinied, while the home front faced severe inflation and food shortages. In February 1917, the February Revolution erupted. Hundreds of thousands of workers, citizens, and soldiers took to the streets of Petrograd. Ordered to suppress the crowds, the military refused and joined the protesters instead. Stripped of support, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated on March 15, 1917, ending 304 years of Romanov rule overnight. Yet the Tsar's fall did not bring peace. The provisional government insisted on continuing the war, fueling public rage. In the chaos, Vladimir Lenin, leader of the radical Bolshevik Party, returned from exile. Lenin offered a message that resonated with the desperate masses: peace, land, and bread. In November 1917, Lenin and his Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace, overthrew the provisional government, and established the world's first communist state. This victory triggered the bloody Russian Civil War between Lenin's Red Army and the White Army, a coalition of monarchists, capitalists, and foreign powers. Amidst the fighting, the former royal family met a grim end. On the night of July 17, 1918, Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children were taken to the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg and executed by a Bolshevik firing squad to prevent the White Army from using them as a rallying symbol. The Civil War claimed between 7 and 12 million lives through combat, famine, and disease. Ultimately, Lenin's Red Army prevailed. In 1922, upon the ashes and blood of the old empire, a new superpower was born, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Lenin built the Soviet state, but his reign was brief. He passed away in 1924. The man who emerged to succeed him was not a theorist, but a man known as the Man of Steel, a ruler who would use an iron fist to purge political rivals, drive millions into forced labor camps, and lead the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany in the bloodiest war in human history. That man was Joseph Stalin. Following Lenin's death in 1924, a fierce power struggle erupted within the Communist Party.
The victor was not the intellectual Leon Trotsky, but a former bank robber from Georgia who called himself Stalin, meaning man of steel. Joseph Stalin ushered the USSR into an era defined simultaneously by terror and massive industrial transformation. His 5-year plans rapidly transformed an agrarian society into an industrial power. Factories, dams, and steel mills rose across the nation, built on the sacrifices of millions. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin initiated the Great Purge. Driven by intense paranoia, he ordered the arrests and executions of generals, officials, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. The NKVD secret police dragged suspects from their homes in the dead of night. Hundreds of thousands were executed, while millions were sent to forced labor in the icy gulag camps of Siberia. Total obedience was enforced through fear. Then, an external catastrophe struck. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler broke the Non-Aggression Pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, unleashing over 3 million Axis troops, tanks, and aircraft in a blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union. Hitler's objective was to subjugate the Slavic population and secure Lebensraum, living space, for the Aryan race. The Soviet military, crippled by Stalin's purges of senior officers, suffered catastrophic initial defeats. Millions of soldiers were encircled. Cities like Leningrad were blockaded for 872 days, where starving citizens endured unimaginable horrors. Yet Hitler underestimated the resilience of the Soviet people. Stalin issued Order Number 227, not a step back. Retreating soldiers faced execution by barrier troops. The conflict transformed from a fight for political ideology into the Great Patriotic War, a battle for absolute national survival. The decisive turning point arrived at Stalingrad in 1942. The city became a graveyard as urban combat raged, building by building, room by room. The average life expectancy of a soldier in the city was less than 24 hours. Yet Soviet defenders held. In the winter, General Georgy Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive, encircling the German Sixth Army. For the first time in World War II, a German field army surrendered completely. Following Stalingrad, the Red Army launched a relentless push westward. At the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, Soviet T-34 armor broke the German armored forces. The Red Army drove Nazi troops off Soviet soil, liberated Eastern Europe, and pushed directly toward the enemy's heart, Berlin. In May 1945, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. Nazi Germany was defeated, but the victory came at a staggering cost. Over 27 million Soviet citizens perished. Virtually every family lost loved ones. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as a global superpower alongside the United States. Stalin extended an iron curtain across Eastern Europe. Successfully testing its first atomic bomb in 1949, the USSR prepared for a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. As the Iron Curtain fell over Europe, the world divided into two blocks, the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. The Cold War was fought not through direct clash in Europe, but across every sphere, from the ocean depths to the vacuum of space. Following Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev assumed leadership. In 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik 1, humanity's first artificial satellite, into orbit. On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space, scoring a monumental victory in the space race. Yet tensions peaked dangerously in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, miles from the Florida coast. The world teetered on the brink of nuclear war, before Khrushchev and President John F. Kennedy negotiated a peaceful resolution. Though direct war was averted, the nuclear arms race and proxy conflicts around the globe drained Soviet resources over the coming decades. In 1979, the Soviet Union made a fatal military misstep by invading Afghanistan to bolster a failing communist government. The Soviet-Afghan War became its Vietnam. For a decade, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers fought against US-backed Mujahideen insurgents. The conflict cost over 15,000 Soviet lives and massive financial expenditures, with little to show but societal trauma. In 1986, disaster struck again with the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. The disaster exposed systemic bureaucratic failures and consumed vast financial resources to contain. With an ailing economy and severe shortages of basic goods, a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, took power in 1985. Gorbachev introduced two major reforms: glasnost, openness, freedom of speech, and perestroika, economic restructuring. Rather than saving the system, these reforms accelerated its collapse. Suppressed national grievances surfaced, and Soviet republics began declaring independence. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, signaling the end of the Cold War era. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. A superpower that had ruled 1/6 of the Earth for 69 years collapsed without a single shot fired in its final moments. The empire fractured into 15 independent nations, leaving Russia to face economic collapse, social instability, and geopolitical decline throughout the 1990s. The 1990s marked Russian military actions in Georgia for Russia. Under President Boris Yeltsin, rapid shock therapy economic reforms led to hyperinflation, wiping out savings. State assets were acquired cheaply by a new class of oligarchs, while crime and poverty surged. From a superpower, Russia was reduced to an impoverished nation reliant on Western loans. This decline left a lasting mark on the national psyche. On December 31, 1999, Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, transferring power to a former KGB officer, Vladimir Putin. Putin assumed leadership focused on restoring order, state authority, and economic stability. He suppressed the Chechen separatist movement, reasserted state control over key industries, and curbed the political influence of the oligarchs. Benefiting from rising global energy prices in the 2000s, Russia experienced significant economic recovery, leading to strong domestic support for Putin's leadership. Internationally, Putin viewed the eastward expansion of NATO as a primary threat to Russian security, famously describing the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a major geopolitical tragedy. 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the full-scale military invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The conflict resulted in extensive international sanctions and economic isolation from Western nations, prompting Russia to realign its economic and diplomatic ties toward Eastern and Southern nations. Over more than a millennium, Russia's history has been shaped by conflict, endurance, and transformation. From its origins among Slavic tribes in the period of Mongol rule, through the Tsarist and Soviet eras, to its role in the contemporary international order.